Come, curator, have a seat. Would you like to hear a tale that I have rediscovered? When you have been around long enough, there becomes fewer things that can surprise you, and few have surpassed the story I have here. Let me tell you a story about a man who reached too far for his own good. He had the best intentions, but there's a saying about where those may lead. There was a young man who lived in a small community in a quiet part of the world. It was a content and simple life where everyone helped care for each other. However, he yearned for more, feeling he could better serve the world outside that community. Eventually, he left his quiet home to find a new place where he could help spread even more good into the world at large, in the way that he had been brought up to. He found a home in a large city, with a kind mentor who offered to train him in various mystical arts, while the two aided all who entered their workshop. His mentor was a man of incredible patience and kindness, who never faltered from his guiding morals. One day, a local noble entered the shop and demanded some unsavory services, the manufacture of tools of death and destruction. The demand was politely denied, naturally, as such horrible creations were a direct contradiction to what those two gentle souls stood for. They had thought the business concluded, but such people as this noble do not understand that the world is not simply owed to them. It was not a few days later that the young man had gone out to collect some materials on the outskirts of town. When he was returning to the workshop, he saw a large plume of smoke in town. He hurried to see if his assistance would be needed, but as he drew closer, he began to realize that the smoke was actually coming from the workshop itself. He rushed over. He had to see if anything could be saved and make sure no one was hurt. However, as he drew closer, he found the city's guard barring his way. Just beyond, the noble who had made demands of his mentor was standing on a makeshift platform, his mentor in binds and kneeling before them. The noble was reading from a list what sounded like political charges, treason, conspiracy for murder, and many more things that flew in the face of everything this man had stood for. When the charges were done being read, a sentence was delivered. An immediate execution was to be carried out. The guards immediately dragged him by the arms and began hauling him towards the burning building. The noble smirked. Just as his mentor was being thrown into the building, they made eye contact with the young man. The door was slammed, barred, and there was nothing but the roar of the fire. Then a voice boomed out, magically enhanced. Do not sink to their level. Continue to breathe goodness into the world or they have won. The crowd was confused and scared at the sudden voice, but the young man knew what he had just heard. His master's last words hung in his mind into the evening, when he stole into the burned wreckage of his former home. He found his master's remains and did what he could to honor him and mourn. When he found the strength in himself to move again, he began to search for anything that may have survived the blaze. Eventually, he found some of the stones on the floor were oddly out of place. When he tested them, they moved out of the way, revealing an old, weathered tome. He recognized this volume. It was one he had only seen his mentor read on rare occasions. Supposedly, it contained dark knowledge best used to combat curses and diseases, but could lead down a dark path if abused. The young man, fool that he was, took the tome with him to study in seclusion. As he began to pore over the volume, he learned why it had been kept so secret and used sparingly. The knowledge contained within was the art of necromancy, the power over death. He studied the grimoire for so long that even its bindings became familiar to him. Finally, he re-emerged into the world. Days had passed, and he found that the people had turned against his beloved mentor. Charms and talismans created to ward evil cast aside, curative salves tossed into the trash heaps. The words on the lips of the townsfolk were those of distrust of someone who only wished to help. How quickly they had turned against another based on the word of one evil man. He remembered the last words he had heard from his master. Breathe goodness into the world. He would. However, he needed to find a way to guarantee that goodness could not disappear. A ritual from the dark book came back to his mind, one that was supposed to achieve immortality. If he could not die, then so too the good of his work would be unable to be snuffed out. He returned to the book and began preparing his course of action. Here we will skip ahead a little bit, curator, as this next part is rather dull. He gathered materials, built up his own shop, and created a secret chamber to carry out the ritual. It took him many, many years. There is one important point to touch on, however. The ritual required a sacrifice of human life. He struggled to come to terms with this. How could he bring himself to end another, even if it meant the eternity of good to follow? He struggled, that is, until he had crossed paths again with the very same noble who had forever changed his life. Could this be the answer he sought? Surely it couldn't be so simple. And yet, an answer had seemed to present itself. He began to plan. He had the knowledge and the skills to be able to pull off a kidnapping. He could keep the villain bound in the secret chamber. Oh, the poetic justice that would be. To force this person to face their own death in binds, just as he had made another do years before. And yet, a voice he had not heard in years echoed in his head. Do not sink to their level, for if you do, they have won. He had spent weeks planning. Could he really give up? Do not sink to their level. He had no choice. If he truly became a monster, what good would his efforts be if this new existence he pursued would be paved in blood? What life could possibly be sacrificed while still being the high road? Unless he was set to throw his own life away already. Perhaps he could use his own? A loophole, perhaps? Yes, if it worked, he would achieve everything he had been working to. And if not, well, he figured he wouldn't care much. At last, the time had come. Years of preparation had led to this day. He set about double-checking his preparations. He had to ensure that everything was right. To mess up would be another great many years of preparation. The runes were correct, the material components in their proper place and quantity, the incantation he could recite forwards and back. He sealed the chamber. No one would be able to get in even if they knew it existed. He steeled his nerves and began the ritual. The concept was simple. His soul would be placed in a small box at the center of the chamber and held there, preventing him from moving on so long as it remained intact. As he began, he thought he saw someone moving in the corner of the room. Impossible, he told himself. It must have been a trick of the shadows. There's no way anyone could be in this chamber without his allowing it. The ritual would take him well into the night, as he knew it would, since he could not interrupt it. There was no going back once he had commit to this. He had finished drawing the runes with the necessary materials and began his incantation. His voice was quiet at first, but it grew as the energies he channeled began to swell. He was clearer, bolder, more confident. He did not allow himself to falter in the face of the energies, which were not like a warm day in the sun and the wind at your back as you would expect from most magics. No, these energies were cold and harsh. They seemed intent to drag him down. But he pushed through. How could he not? The promise of being able to provide an immortal force for good was too great a goal to give up on, for it was bigger than himself. He reached the end of the ritual, uttered the last words, performed the last gestures. And then he stood there in silence. Nothing was happening. That couldn't be right. He was sure he had performed the ritual perfectly. Could it be, then, that his sacrifice wasn't sufficient? Perhaps there wasn't a loophole after all. He slumped to the ground, defeated. It seems he would need a sacrifice and many more years of work to regather everything. But then, he noticed a faint glow beginning to permeate the dim chamber. The air began to stir. The glow grew, and the movement turned into a breeze. And so did the two continue to rise until the light was blinding and the wind a deafening roar. He felt his very essence being ripped from his body. The pain was excruciating. He could feel his form twisting into something new, taller and broader, with the flesh disappearing from it. The light and wind died down. He could see the vessel pulsing with power. He had done it. I had done it. Yes. This was my story. It was then that I became fully aware of my visitors. Yes, multiple. It was impossible that one person, let alone two, could have been in there without my noticing first. But impossible doesn't really mean anything where those two were concerned. She spoke first, and she spoke with fury. Not an indignant, self-righteous fury, but that of a parent, disappointed in a child who has just hurt itself. She said so much so fast that in my state I didn't catch everything she said. But I did know she wanted to undo what I had just done. That my triumph was abhorrent. She would then guarantee that I had no way of ever doing it again. That was when he stepped in. Impossible to read, passive, calmer than any I have ever seen. He spoke to her and calmed her down. Then he turned to me with almost something resembling a small smile on his face. You're an interesting one for sure. Then he made me an offer. Help him. Apparently, my talents could be of some use to him. Or we do as his wife suggested. I'd say you know enough about me by now, Saito, to know that I don't like wasting my efforts. So without knowing what I was about to agree to, I said, where do I sign? Again, he gave the tiniest of smiles, and they took me away with them, here, to the archives. Only once have I had the opportunity to ask Dick why he took me in, and his response raised yet more questions. I understood. I was made a guardian, charged to watch over a part of the archives. I use my skills to give animation to those souls that are not happy with the fate they have been handed. Many set to be cast down would struggle to earn their right to climb into the heavens. Some don't feel they've done enough to deserve the peace and assist around the archives. There are those who have worries about the lands they came from. We send them back as spirits for a time. But everything comes at a price. When they return to their natural form, these books, they have a bit more wear on them. Enough damage, and they may even lose a part of their story, a part of themselves. But what about me? Well, my story is gone, and yet it isn't. I will never be able to truly die because of what I did to myself. There will be no great beyond for me, unfortunately. But these stories here need someone to read them, and so I will until everything comes to an end. Then we shall see what the fates have in store for me.